Okay, the map.cfg. So CFG is short for config or configuration file for your map. And what that is basically a text document which has a bunch of different commands for your map. So specifically for this tutorial, it will be loading these custom textures. You can see I have textures here which are not in the default Sauerbraten. These are the Yves EX textures, and I had to load them into the game manually, and I did that through the config file. You can also add in commands in that file for loading a certain skybox, skylight and sunlight values, pretty much anything when it comes to the map aspects you can add into the config file. So enough talking about it. How do you get into it? If you're in edit mode in co-op edit, in single player, if you hit escape, go to your main menu, you'll see an editing tab. If you're in actual co-op edit, like on a server, you have to go into your edit mode, and then your editing tab will show up here. And then the last tab on the right is CFG. This is your config file. And you can see in here I already have a bunch of commands. These are all the texture commands, which loads the textures. Alright. Now, a lot of times, the textures that you want to use, if you are going to use custom textures, they will come with a pre-made config file. And all you have to do is take that file and rename it to the name of your map. So this is just example TPM140B. It's the name of this map, .cfg. You just have to rename it to that, and then when you load your map, it'll load all the textures. Alright, make sure you add a texture reset. This command is very important right here. Texture reset, one word. If you are using custom textures, it is usually smart to add this at the very beginning of your CFG, or at least before you start calling up textures. Because what that does is it clears all the other textures in Sauerbraten, and then it's like a clean slate, so there's no textures when you do a texture reset. And then you go and start adding the textures that you want, and only the textures that you want. Alright, so that not only saves map load time because it doesn't have to load all the default textures, but it makes things a lot more easier and neater. Alright, and then once you add the texture reset, you need to load up the two default textures again, because you cleared them, and that would be the sky texture and the default texture, which is this gray checkered texture. And so just copy these two commands after the material reset, or texture reset, excuse me. Now these have to be the first two slots. Alright, sky has to be the first slot, and default has to be the second slot, because if you hit F2 in edit mode, you'll see they will always be the first two textures. Even if I load it up like one of these other textures first before loading these two, whenever I select the texture that I have first, it's going to act as a sky texture, and it's just going to make things all messy. So always load the sky texture, and then the default texture, and then the rest of your textures. Alright, so let's go back. So you can just copy these two into all of your CFGs. And then after that, you can add in the rest of the textures. Alright. Now, what are we looking at here? This config right here, I basically copied from the EX, I can't remember what it was called, ex.cfg or textures.cfg, which came with the textures. I just copied it into this map config file. So all of these commands were already pre-typed out for me. So the first commands here are the shaders. And if you don't know what shaders are, basically if I walk over to these textures, you can see how they're sort of 3D, even though they're not 3D. These textures aren't a great example because they don't have a lot of 3D aspects, or at least not with the CFG I have right now. But if you look at some textures, if you've ever looked at textures, like especially on Ryzen, if you've ever gone on the map Ryzen and you've had all shaders turned on, you can see that they look very 3D. The floor looks like they're made up of individual tiles, which pop out at you, which aren't actually geometry, they're just the textures. And so that's what shaders are, or those are what shaders are. For the most part, you can also do like some different sort of lighting, or different. You can do like pulse lighting for certain lights. All right, so that's what these set shader. Set shader would be the actual name of the shader, and you can go onto the Sauerbraten editing reference, which I'll add a link, and you can look up all the different kinds of shaders you can use. So this is the shader that these textures use, and then the set shader param or parameter is going to specify the actual values of the certain shader values or shader aspects. So we have bump, spec, map, parallax, world, and then for this config we have the spec scale and the parallax scale manually specified as these values here. Alright, so this is getting a little confusing, but if your map or if your textures come with the config file already, you don't have to worry about a lot of this stuff. Alright, and now we're getting to the texture. So texture 0 is always going to be the actual texture. Alright, and so texture 0, you would add that as a command, and then the texture that follows. So you can see here it has a file path. It always starts from the packages folder of your Sauerbraten directory. So it would be packages. You don't have to add the packages, but within packages, the texture is in our textures folder, then give us a layer, then ex, and then the name of the texture. Right? That is the file path for these textures. So that is why it has the entire file path written out here. Then you can see it has some values over here. You can add text or values after your texture. The first 3 would be your red, green, and blue values, so you can change the texture color if you want. And then the 4th value would be the scale. By default, it's 1, which is just the default texture scale, just normal size. You can cut that down to 0.5. You can cut it down to 0.25, which would be a quarter of the size. You can cut it down to 0.025, as small as you want, pretty much. Alright, so I have it 0.25, that is a quarter of the scale of the actual texture. And then down here I have 0.5. Now, all these textures, or all these other textures, the texture N, texture S, texture Z, these are all the bump maps, or the spec maps. To be honest, I'm not sure exactly how all of these work. All I know is that they add some 3D value. One of them adds some 3D value. I believe that's the bump map. I could be completely wrong. And adds all the shaders and stuff. These are all the shaders. So texture 0 is the texture, and then all the following ones are the shaders. Now you don't have to have these ones, these following through 3, but you do have to have the texture 0 because that's the actual texture. These, like I said, are just shaders, optional, make things look more pretty. Alright, so if we were going to create this config on our own, let's load up a map that shows an example of that. Okay, here we are on another map which uses custom textures. Now this is a map I created. These textures I actually had, they did not come with their own config file, so I actually had to create the config for this map. So let's scroll down. I have the texture reset, I have the 2 default textures, and then I get into the textures themselves. Now these textures also don't have any shader textures like any bump maps or anything, so it's just all texture 0, all the default, all the basic textures. Now I actually had to go in here and create this config and type in every single one of these textures, which is pretty simple but pretty tedious. Alright, But we're going to focus on the simple part of it, because all you have to do is type texture 0 and then the file path. Alright, so starting at the packages folder, wherever the texture is. So you would go to textures, Philip K, withered wad, PKW, tiles, O2A. Now if these weren't in the textures folder, if they were in just the Philip K folder, like if it was packages, Philip K, withered wad, whatever, it would just start at Philip K, alright? Because it's not in the textures folder. But just remember, it starts at the packages folder. You don't have to add the packages, just whatever comes after that. And so once I created this as a text document, I just simply renamed it to the name of the map. For this case, it's just SHK layout to .cfg. Now remember to add that .cfg extension so that Sauerbraten knows to load this up. And make sure the CFG goes in with the map itself, alright? And you can refer to the video of using custom content. But make sure this config file goes in with the actual map itself, alright? And then Sauerbraten by default will automatically load it up with the map, as long as it's named the same as the map. Alright, and then I have all my custom textures here. Press F2, you can see all of them here.